Hey guys, Bluffmunkey back again for Sonic Academy, and today I would like to have a little chat about rolling bass lines. See what I did there? Rolling bass lines. We're going to have a little chat about what they are, what they mean, and I'll give you a couple of examples of how to make them. So let's get stuck straight in. So I remember about 10 years ago or so, every question on the internet was, how do I make a rolling bass line? When trance was kind of at its peak. Well, at its peak 10, 15 years ago. Everybody wanted to know how to make rolling bass lines. But I just wanted to have a little chat about what they are. So to be topical, I thought what we'd do is we'd ask the machine what they are and see what the machine says. So, you know, everybody else is talking about that now. So we might as well try and use the resources available to us. So what is a rolling bass line? Okay, rolling bass line, commonly found in electronic dance music. Yeah, okay. Character repeating continuous pattern of bass notes that create a sense of motion and groove. Yeah, okay. Rolling, often bass lines flow smoothly and continuously without any abrupt changes or pauses. I'll go along with that. Combination of sustained notes and shorter notes, staccato notes that create a rhythmic pulse. I'll go along with that as well. Rolling bass lines are often created with synthesizers or other electronic instruments, and we're in genres including techno, yeah, house, yeah, drum and bass. Drum and bass, idiot machine. Yeah, so mainly it's a repetitive rolling, galloping. So if you think about a horse, this might hurt. You know, a rolling, repetitive and or galloping bass line. Made up of mostly short staccato notes, but we will have a look an example of how a rolling bass line can be more than just one series of notes. In terms of when they started, I'm thinking from my memory, I'll try and find something on YouTube to kind of play over what I'm talking about here. But from my memory, I think they really started in the 70s with the disco boom. That first disco was arguably the first proper mainstream EDM genre. You did have variants of techno and house kind of appearing at the same time. But I think in terms of what you might recognise, even if you were born way after the 70s, so tracks like one you've probably never heard of, there was a track by Space called Magic Fly, or was it Magic Fly Space? I can't remember. Arguably, technically the first trance track as well, if you really use your imagination. But it really did have this plodding bass line that could be described as a rolling bass line. And another really famous one would be Donna Summer, I Feel Love. That was a massive kind of... It was possibly one of the first EDM anthems, and I use inverted commas there, but heavy use of synthesizers and repetitive drums and bass line. So it was that kind of era that spawned, because obviously people started using the synths in the 70s. But really today, there's a couple of genres that are still based on the rolling bass line. Now, if you have a look at the techno tutorial I did a few weeks ago, there is a whole section on the bass line there, so you can have a look at that one as well. But I just want to start off with a couple of examples, very simple examples of current rolling bass lines that you might recognise. So I've got a couple of very simple loops here. The first one is called Psy, the second one is called Trance. Now, I've put some MIDI in already, but listening to these things one at a time, I've got a kick and a loop going. And in terms of synth or bass line, I've got this. So very simple. Where's my notes gone? So these are 16th notes, but they're running on one, there's a gap. So it's 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, 13, 15, 16, 17. So instead of it being every 16th note, every quarter note where the kick would hit, the notes left absent. So playing this with the kick as well. So this is a classic, most basic type of Psy-Trance bass. But what we want to do, or what I want to do, is create more of a Psy-Trance sound. At the moment, it's just the initialized saw preset. So for the most part, you're only going to be using, the vast majority of Psy-Trance bass lines only use a very simple single saw tooth. Now, we want to make sure that the oscillator phase is set to re-trigger. So in Psy-Trance, very, very big on oscillator phase and everything being absolutely rigid and absolutely perfect in terms of oscillator phase. So we're going to have re-trigger on. So try and listen to the difference between re-trig on and off. This isn't an irrelevant detail either, because if we go back to what ChatGPT said, it's this repetitive nature of the bass line which can be used to describe something that's called a rolling bass line. And when you have re-trigger on, each hit, each note is going to be exactly the same, to the point where a lot of Psy-Trance, commercial Psy-Trance artists will actually even resample the bass note to absolutely guarantee that each bass note is exactly the same. So what we also want to do is pull in, let's go for, let's just use a low pass, a standard low pass for now. And what I want to do is assign the filter envelope and use it very, very, going to keep a slight amount of release on there. And the trick here is to get the decay amount just right. So have a play with the decay time, the curve shape, and the envelopes. It's those three things moving together. So it's a little bit like using a compressor. You've got the threshold, you've got the attack, you've got the release, but you've also got the ratio as well. All those things are relative to each other. And it's kind of the same when you're creating this kind of plucky Psy-Trance bass as well. There's no one setting that's going to work well. It's also dependent on the length of your kick and the tempo of the track as well. So try and get those three right together. Let me just turn this up a little bit. So something like that. I might want to have the bass line slightly louder. -1. And then in turn, we're not going to heavily go into processing here, but what I might do is just pull in an EQ8. So once you've got that basic bass line in, what you could also do is something like that. So you start to build up that Psy-Trance sound. So the nature, that the fundamental structure of the bass line is repetitive in nature, but you can put in these little frills, and they do that in Psy-Trance all the time. So let's duplicate that again. So we do something like that. And then one other thing I might want to try is think about that galloping nature that we spoke about as well. At the moment, the bass line is quite static. It's static all the way through. So I will pull in the old faithful LFO tool on the bass line. So of course you could use a compressor to do this as well. I'm going to pull the LFO tool before my utility. Yeah, so you can use a compressor to do this as well, but for me, workflow-wise, LFO tool is always the daddy because it's just drag and drop, it's easy, and I'm lazy. So let's pull the depth all the way down. And what I want to do is keep this fairly kind of average settings, probably around there. Again, do it by ear. And then I'm going to pull in the depth until I hear the kind of movement that I want on the bass line. So let's solo this. Just take that little click off. So because you've put LFO tool on, I might need to even increase the volume of the bass line even more, because sometimes when you put LFO tool on, it decreases the perceived volume a little bit. So have a listen to this against the kick. So with LFO tool off, I mean, it kind of works, but it's very static. And also what LFO tool does as well is, I have mentioned this in another video. I think it was in my, I've done a video on LFO tool where I've used it for this purpose. But sometimes you will get the tail end of the kick just encroaching on the first Psy-Trance bass note in each of those triplets. So this kind of guarantees that they're not going to hit each other and interfere with each other. But it also sounds better, I think. So there's that. Now, the second option I want to give you is very similar, but it's the trance bass line. So again, I've got a kick and a little loop. And then this is trance bass line 1. And then I've got a second bass line as well, which I'm going to play by itself. So this bass line in itself isn't what you'd call a rolling bass line. It's quite staccato and fairly rhythmic. But it does work in conjunction with the more rolling aspect of this trance bass line. And trance does this a lot, where you layer up bass line after bass line. So altogether, so I'm just running initialized presets at the moment. So let's get a plucky bass line in this first trance bass line 1. I'm just going to pull in an EQ on here. Just want to make sure, because we don't want a lot of bass in this sound. So I'm just going to use a saw wave, a detuned saw wave, and get this plucking as quickly as possible. I'm just going to use standard filters. So something like that, and then we're just going to copy to 2, and I'm going to take this down an octave and see how that sounds. And then we'll put a delay on it as well. Let's use the ping pong delay, because the thing about these delays on trance bass lines is they add some width, and this trance bass 1 isn't really a bass. It's kind of more of a mid-range thing, but it acts as the bass line, a little bit like the Donna Summer thing. If you go bass and listen to it, the bass line isn't really a bass line. It doesn't sit very low down. But we will support trance bass with trance bass 2, which will be lower. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So let's try something like this. Okay, that'll do me. Let's just EQ this a bit. So somewhere around there, I think. you'll recognise that sound, don't you? So let's do something with Trance Bassline 2 now. I'm going to do this in isolation quickly, pull in an EQ, and the classic way I would do this would be to have a saw wave and a square wave. So I'm going to pick, I'm just going to pick the standard waveforms for now. Let me just try this. So I will choose the same filter again. So I'm going to go with something like that, and then just playing them together to see what they sound like. So do you see how they work with each other? Trance Bass 2 is more of the low end. So what I might want to do with this one is to get them working together. I might pull up the kind of mid-highs of Trance Bassline 1. And then Trance Bassline 2, I'll pull that down. And then last thing I want to do is I'm going to group these together. So we're subgrouping the group. Bass lines. And there's quite a lot of movement in these. So what I want to do, and by the way, we're not going to set any delay on Trance Bass 2. I want to compress these two together a little bit. And again, this isn't going to be a massive tutorial on effects and processing. And then the same thing again, I'm going to pull in LFO tool on the Basslines bus or the Basslines group. But we're going to just do this subtly. I want to hear that with the kick. And in fact, I'm going to put LFO tool before the compressor. So we're doing the same thing again. It's still a rolling bass line. That Trance Bass 2, the lower one, works with Trance Bass 1, which is the rolling one. And then we're just using LFO tool to slightly move them out of the way of the kick. And then, of course, once you've got that fundamental rolling bass line going, we can then duplicate this a couple of times and maybe... try that. Don't like that one. No. There. Yeah, something like that. So once you've got it running and rolling and you've got everything working together, then you can mess around with the notes afterwards. So that's a couple of examples of rolling bass lines. Really, if we go back to the ChatGPT example, which I tend to agree with, it's this feeling of movement, this feeling of rhythmic continuity, something that doesn't stop and start. And that's the whole point of this. You can change the notes around, but you're using the bass line as much for rhythm as for melody and for low end. The bass line becomes part of the rhythmic structure of the track, so to speak. So just a little short video. I hope you found this useful, guys. Again, like I said, go back and look at the techno tutorial I did a few weeks ago. There's a section on bass lines in there. Techno also uses quite a lot of rolling bass lines, so there's a whole video on that in there as well. So I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you guys again soon. Cheers.